Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Tech Behind Fintech. Happy Friday. I'm here joined by a good friend, colleague, David Churchill. Dave, welcome to the Tech Behind Fintech.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everybody.
This is definitely a long time in the making. I was trying to get Dave on for a while. I'm happy he's on today. Your presence is greatly appreciated.
Hey, I know it's been a while. Been working on it. All the bribe money really helped out. That was fantastic. That always does it.
You see, you can't tell people I pay to play because everyone's going to be expected to get. You're kind of ruining the whole thing for me. It's going to get quite expensive to run this show right now.
I'm kidding. Being in your presence and everyone here, that is the true payment. That is what I get.
You know, Dave, you're warming my heart. I appreciate you. So, what I do with all guests, first of all, let me say, this is the Tech Behind Fintech. We talk really about the technology behind money. I always want to say that because we do, whether it's financial technology, crypto, fintech, especially just the technology behind that and the unsung heroes in that industry that do the behind the scenes work. I'm the host, Nnamdi Osuagwu. With that said, I want to read my guest bio. David Churchill is a software architect and expert in software design with modern technologies and methodologies. A founder at DraftPoint Inc., David plays many roles across the company's initiative to provide dynamic and cutting-edge technology solutions within the financial services space. He is comfortable playing project manager, lead architect, or technology expert across many of the projects his clients are currently engaged in. Exciting stuff, Dave.
Yeah, man. It sounds like I don't have enough time for all that, but somehow
you still managed to make the show.
Right, exactly. I should be doing some of that stuff right now.
And that's why I appreciate you. So listen, like we always do, want to shout out to all the people watching. If you're watching, let's see some of those comments so we can know that you're there. Happy Friday to all. So like we always do, we jump into the news segment before our main topic of the day. So our main topic of today came up with this title: Little Bank Takes Big Bank. Let's start with microservice adoption. So that's definitely a play on words. There's a song called Big Bank Takes Little Bank. We're not going to get into all that. But so we're going to get into microservice adoption as our topic of the day. Prior to that, we're going to talk about some news articles that we found interesting, get David's opinion on it, and then take it from there. So the first one, Aetherium this week hit an all-time high of $4,382.73. Wow. This is something that started about 6 years after Bitcoin started. And it's just that price is amazing. A lot of people made a lot. One of the people that made a lot, I found this posting really funny. Goldman Sachs banker quits after making millions in cryptocurrency. And he basically left. Aziz Mohan or something like that. Yeah, he betted on it and it worked out well for him. What are your thoughts there, Dave?
I mean, it's kind of the story, right? Like this is the cryptocurrency story. Like we've seen this, name the currency and we would have seen this sort of thing. So it's hard to predict. It's hard to, wrap your hands around it, but it's fascinating to see it, explode like this and to see the interest in the market. Obviously there's a lot of still volatility there. I'm sure you heard the comments from Elon on Saturday Night Live. I know that's leading right into this, right? And what happened there? So it's a kind of it just speaks to the whole market, right?
Yeah. So what Dave's referring to, another article. So Elon Musk put out a tweet saying that Tesla's no longer accepting Bitcoin for payment of their vehicles because of the impact on energy that crypto mining takes place. So with that said, Bitcoin and Dogecoin and a bunch of other stuff crashed. went down a bit with this one tweet, like, you know, it's the Kanye song, no one man should have that much power. But apparently his tweets do. So very interesting. But out of all of them, Cardano recovered and they're up, but a lot of other ones went down. I mean, I know Bitcoin early in the week was at like 58,000. Now it's 50. We have a comment from an audience member, a friend of the show and former guest, Medina. All other duties are assigned all other duties as assigned. She was talking about your many, many roles at DraftPoint Inc. Yeah, he does a lot of different things there for his international company. So pretty impressive. So the next article I want to jump into after the Bitcoin news, PayPal deepens Google's cloud relationship with new infrastructure deal. PayPal says its total active customers saw a traffic spike of 24% during the peak of the coronavirus pandemic. Sorry about that. The firm adds now more than 392 million active users. So let me do one thing real quick that I thought I did, put that phone on mute. All right, most of PayPal data resides in its SAP database, SAP database. It also utilizes SAP's financial products subledger delivered at massive scale using Google Cloud. One more quote before we jump in. We can only develop fast, build fast, and deploy fast if we have infrastructure that's nimble as we are, says Wes Hummel, Vice President of Site Reliability at Cloud Engineering at PayPal. What are your thoughts there? I know, you know, it's a big between AWS, Azure, GCP. Those are the three heavyweights in the public cloud computing space. So it's interesting to see this deal come to fruition.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'd seen it recently as well. It definitely speaks a lot to Google's cloud products and like what headway they're making into the space. You know, certainly the AWS is the giant there you know, they're one to tackle, but it's interesting to see that diversity kind of being split up a bit, which is good, I think.
And from you know, doing some research, talking to some folks, I mean, on a Google's perspective, since they come in third, their platform, they're advertising more hybrid, right? So we could you have something else, like we know you're already on something else, but here's what you can utilize us for. So to have PayPal say we're going to go with them as a full solution, I find that interesting. I also would like to know more about other financial services, more incumbents, you know, big investment banks, how they're utilizing some of those services and so forth. Very interesting stuff to dive into. So we're speaking of nimble development, moving fast, building fast. So that brings us to the topic of the day, microservices architecture.
Sure.
Little bank takes big bank. So the reason for that title is because, you know, essentially, you know, in thinking about it, you have companies that are not traditional. They're software companies, like, you know, that are now in the fintech space, right? You know, Facebook owns WhatsApp. WhatsApp has WhatsApp Pay. Amazon has different things like that. Google. These are things that we covered over the last few months, and they're basically encroaching in the traditional financial services space. But how are they doing that? They're doing that with obviously faster development. They're more agile. They're more nimble, and you know, so they could come up with these concepts and implement at a faster pace, and they're not bogged down by maybe some of the regulations that a bigger bank would be. So, you know, and in looking at that, the bigger banks, you know, the monolithic legacy applications, and then you have microservices. So on that note, Dave, can you explain to the audience what is microservices?
Yeah, I mean, just like you know, it's a deep topic. It's a big topic. You know, it's hard to cover in a short period of time, but you know, just at a high level, I mean, actually, the title could have easily been "Big Banks with an S takes." Or little banks take the big bank, you know, because in the sense of microservices, you really take your traditional monolithic application and you would break it up into services into smaller chunks. That's, you know, but that conversation really, you know, you have to kind of think about both strategies, the monolithic strategy versus like this microservice strategy. So most of us are familiar over time with the monolithic approach, and that approach has like many variations. Some people might argue that their monolithic application, well, I use services, I use small bits and services and bring them in, but typically, if your services have to be tested together, deployed together, if you're changing one and you have to test another one, you're not truly in a microservice situation. You're more in a distributed services application. So like the approach to a microservice really has to start with architecting your application in such a way that you can really put your application pieces into components that are loosely coupled with the other components. They have no dependencies on the other components. And they really just take on one small piece of the application. So you can really separate it out so that if you make a change in one, there is no implication over any other piece. That's kind of like the true microservice architecture. And there's obviously a lot of detail to that. But I think you have an example in the slides that you have. Maybe we can show a quick example.
Oh yeah, sure. Let's do it. Let's do it. I think this one is.
Yeah, so just as a kind of like a quick example of what we're talking about in terms of microservices, you might have a classic application like this represented here is maybe an e-commerce site where you have the customer service, the product service, and the cart service. So in kind of the classic example, you have a monolithic application. You might have all three of these services. They might be built as a service within the application, like distributed service application, but if you change one, you have to change all of them. Go ahead.
You know what? Just to add in right there, right? So from a person who worked on the release management side at big investment banks, back, well, I'm not going to say I don't know back in the days, but back in the days, even sometimes current days, but especially back, it was extremely painful to deploy these applications because the biggest problem is dependencies. Like in this example, sometimes you may fix something in customer service, but you inadvertently touch something in product service. But until you basically do that end-to-end testing, you just don't know. So the biggest challenge we had when we were, some of these monolithic legacy apps is deploying, and you don't know what the hell broke once you put it out there. Huge challenge constantly.
Right.
So the function that you may have worked on may have worked perfectly, but now it's in production. Maybe your regression test didn't cover everything. Now something else that you didn't even know was a dependency is now being impacted. So that was a major challenge with the monolithic architecture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like in the beginning, when you're first building the application, deploying it, it's a little bit easier. But over time, as that application grows and there's more pieces added, then you get into that situation that you're describing, where your DevOps folks are, maybe you're doing an update, you're adding a function. The entire application has to go down on, say, like a Friday night, and then your DevOps folks are spending the weekend trying to get this thing back up and running and stabilized so it can be ready for Monday morning. So that's obviously an extreme case, but it's one we've seen, right?
Is it really extreme? I mean, you get, especially if you look at banking and on the investment bank side, you have these applications that's been around for years, and what happens sometimes is the original people who built it, that team, they went on to other jobs. Now you have new people here. So I've been places where they don't fully grasp that new applications. As you said, it's component after component being built, and you don't have one person with that historical knowledge to get the big picture. They just know their little piece. So it's almost like they're working in a microservices way, but because they're little piece, but not really getting the big picture, and then things are impacted. So those weekends that you just talked about, that's a very real thing. I've spent many weekends doing that painful exercise to get it ready for the business on Monday.
Right. And then your releases become less frequent, right? You have to do, you go from monthly releases to quarterly releases, and then you're doing you push them off to once a year because of all the testing, the integrations that are involved. That monolithic style really can become a hindrance to the DevOps folks, to the developers in that across that entire area.
Production support also, right? Because now
Sure.
you know you deliver it and everything. And I've seen cases, and Dave has too, where it's deployed, everything's working, everybody's doing the high five stuff, and then in the middle of the week, someone from the business, maybe he wasn't involved in UAT like they should have been, right? Now, some random thing that only happens once a month, they're trying to implement, and all of a sudden that's broken, and it's a whole emergency patch scrambling to get everything ready.
Right. Sure. In a lot of cases that you're redeploying pieces that wouldn't normally have to, if it was broken down into pieces. You're also kind of restricted in some other ways too, from a development point of view. If the application was built on Java 5 years ago and you need to add some more functionality to the core functionality, you're going to have to stick with that Java framework. That's the only way to do it, unless you are then complicating your infrastructure and building another service somewhere, and then it's a distributed service application. So the language restraints the technology restraints, and certainly if you have to say upgrade your server, you're going from a Windows server to the next version, that in and of itself can cause a lot of problems depending on whatever technology decisions that were made and things like that. So a lot of problems with the monolithic approach. It's not necessarily the wrong approach in certain cases, but those are really the challenges, and those are a lot of the the big problems that you can run into with that sort of approach. So moving on to like a microservice technology. So that same example, from microservices perspective, we would then break up some of the pieces of the application. The application is as a unit, a full application that maybe your users, the end users are seeing it. They don't know that it's separate pieces, but you can actually logically break up those pieces. So in this example, the customer database, the customer information is now a service, microservice. The product information is now a microservice, and maybe the customer's cart is a microservice, kind of this classic e-commerce application. So now the advantage here, and there's quite a lot of advantages. Number one, if you break these into pieces, ideally they are siloed in such a way they are within what we call microservices like containers, and that their configuration, their logic, everything that is related to those pieces is really independent of the rest of the application. So customer information in this case is not the same thing as the product information. So that there's a clear boundary there. There's a lot and a whole other topics, and many hours can be spent about talking about how to do this, right? And obviously we can't get to that today, but there is, for those listening and wondering about that, how do you make that decision? You have to look at it in terms of like the bounded context of the logical pieces of the application, how to break that up, how to say these two pieces are separate. That's a big deal within microservices, because if you get it wrong, you'll be in situations where you are having to test one another, and you kind of put yourself back into that monolithic scenario. But if you get it right and you're able to separate things out, you can create those pieces in containers so that they are individually deployable, so that you can make changes, say in this case to the customer microservice, that doesn't affect anything else. You can just make changes to that. If there's a new feature that we need to add there, or a change we need to add there, we can deploy just that piece of the application. And with that type of flexibility, then some of those problems that we talked about before, kind of alleviate themselves. So for example, that heroic deployment that Nnamdi was talking about, for those DevOps folks, that's now reduced to a much smaller footprint. Now they just need to deploy one piece, and it's the testing is completely separate. So there's less risk in change. Scaling can be independent. There's certain interesting scenarios here too, that some other interesting advantages here, not only just to the deployment and to the changes, but also the technology choices. So say your customer microservice is built by a team doing Node.js, and then your cart is built by .NET folks. That all works perfectly in this environment because those pieces are communicating to each other via APIs, or possibly in some cases people use like queuing, like RabbitMQ or MSNQ, things like that, to talk to each other. But because they're loosely coupled, then those technology decisions can be made independently of each other. So you can kind of have those type of things. Some
Dave,
of the go ahead.
Real quick, just to circle back, 'cause I think it's an important point you mentioned, and I want to kind of like drill down on that. The boundaries, right? Like that exercise, 'cause I would think that's a coordination with development in the business in terms of really clearly separating it, because like you said, the whole point of it is to break it into small units, right? So
Right.
per business function. But now if you have multiple business functions in your, say you have, 100 microservices, but 50 of them, or a large majority of them, are doing a bunch of things, then you're back in this with the same problem. So how does that exercise work? How does that conversation happen?
That's an interesting one. I mean, basically, you have to break down the problem into kind of like seams. You have to like have boundaries, and it's that context, so that there's some sort of boundary between the data on one side versus the data on the other side. So the customer product boundary is an easy one, right? Because that's pretty clear. Like a customer is a person with specific information, address, name, and things like that. Where a product is an object, it's or it's a service, it's some product that can be sold. The boundary there is pretty straightforward. In some cases, the boundary can be a little bit more loosely defined. In the case where you have the customer and the payment service, the customer is going to have some payment information. That boundary becomes a little bit more unclear. Although we can probably think of it as a clear boundary, but you have those kind of situations. So it's not an easy topic. It's not an easy conversation to have, but it's one that's very important for the microservice architecture to get right. So you want to have kind of like these natural boundaries in the problem domain. Like for example, another example is in fintech. For sending, for sending wires across, for building a wire application, we might choose a boundary as being the bank account information versus the actual wire validation, wire construction piece of those. We might create a boundary there and say, like, the validation piece doesn't need to know the information about the bank itself, but it's just doing kind of its one validation job. So that.
Can we use an analogy where if from a computer science perspective, and you start learning about object-oriented programming and you're building all your different objects and methods to do different things, can that be like analogous to that?
So yeah, but I think the one interesting thing about microservices, and when you're designing an application, like, so if you're a developer and you're building you're developing classes for your application. A lot of the ways that you think about it is you kind of think about it in terms of a library architecture. So it's similar, but not exactly the same. So for example, if I'm building an application in .NET, let's say I'm building in .NET, I might make certain classes, I might make certain services. My intention is to build a robust application and potentially reuse classes within my base. So I might write some base classes where I might reuse that over and over again. In microservices, you wouldn't necessarily think of it in that way, because you don't want to have one service that requires, these other services to be kind of part. Like, it's a little bit, it's similar, but it's a little bit different. Like the thought process is, like you were kind of saying it earlier, it like needs to be a discussion with the business. The thought process is really like those boundaries, like that context, a bounded context, needs to be really in the business problem, like the problem you're trying to solve. That's where the boundary needs to be driven. Where in development wise, you don't necessarily derive your code classes based off of the problem that you're trying to solve. You do it based off of the data architecture that you're trying to come up with. So it's similar, but I would definitely say not completely analogous, at least in terms of how I've seen it, and like the thought process going behind it.
I love your explanation. It makes sense. I mean, like everything we talk to, it really is a conversation that you have to have with the business. I mean, I always say this, like we start getting too technology heavy, and when I talk to some clients, I'm like, it's still business driven. Like, Like the
Right.
technology is a tool to help you get to a goal, right?
Right.
And it could be a complex tool, it could be a simple tool, but it is a tool. But without that business driving and that conversation, you'll miss the mark 100% of the time.
Right. So, and like this architecture is really interesting, and there are some other advantages to it other than like the deployment sense. The since every piece of the application kind of functions separately, you can use technologies out there today. Like there's a lot of technology, like for example, Docker is one of them. I think Red Hat's got some technology. There's a lot of different products that are out there that are available to kind of create these containers and make them set up the security around them. And, obviously AWS is set up this way as well. There's lots of things there. But some of the interesting things that you can do is, let's say, for example, in this example, your cart service, there's a huge sale going on, right? At your application, there's like this huge weekend sale. It's like Memorial Day. And people are hitting your site much more than you were anticipating. Let's just say, for example, your cart service was getting bombarded because people are just throwing stuff in their cart. They're just buying everything. And let's say that's actually slowing down your application. You can, in certain cases, kind of with like a Docker type approach, you can copy it's in a container. You can actually copy your service, kind of balance it within your application, and you can scale almost very quickly to have like multiple instances that's not that you're able to take advantage of. Or if you need to make a quick change for, say, like a different country, there's something that doesn't make sense in your particular cart, it's just configuration based. You can actually take a copy of your container, redeploy it, change the configuration, and it's now part of your application servicing maybe a different country, something along those lines. So there's a lot of flexibility once you build your application like this. But again, like that's the, so those are some of the big advantages. The kind of the challenges of this infrastructure, as you can imagine, things are separated out. The challenge can be really around the alignment, and how you architect it. So you really do have to think about those boundaries up front. If one team is working on one section, they might not know the other sections, and that might be okay. That might be what you want, but for certain application teams, that may not make sense. So for certain size teams, so for example, if I was working on if I was doing an application with a small team, like say 2 or 3 developers, might not consider microservices as the first approach, because a smaller application with a couple of developers, kind of like a distributed service application might make more sense. But for certainly large applications like e-commerce type applications, where there is a lot of complexity, a lot of moving pieces, and multiple teams working on it, this is a very good strategy for getting getting that building that application.
You know what? Let's dive into that. That opens up a whole series of questions in terms of when you said a small team. Like, even when we talk about the fintech space, some of these teams start very small. I mean, some of them even leverage, pre-existing applications like that they build on top of to deliver their end solution. So even with a small team, this is an architecture you might not go with if you have 2 or 3 people you're thinking.
It depends on the scope of the application. So, if the application is if we're building a application that's public facing, we might want to start with the microservice approach. But if it's if we are building an application that's maybe an internal application, something for say a bank or for a hedge fund or something like that, where the problem space is smaller, the application is meant to sit in a smaller space. Depending on the size of the team and depending on the scope of the application, I would probably, in that case, go with, or at least design a distributed service application, which is like, kind of like a hybrid. It's between monolithic. I mean, obviously the true monolithic application where everything is in one project, that's always challenging. But you can kind of have that middle ground where you have that distributed distributed service approach where you have multiple services, they will inherently need to be tested with each other if you make one change. But in terms of developing that, deploying that with a smaller team, it's a little bit less challenging if the scope is smaller. If your scope is larger and you're anticipating a large user base, you're anticipating growth, you don't know where the end of your application is going to be necessarily, then starting with the microservice approach may be the best option. But it's definitely not the option in all cases, but it's definitely a good option for many complex applications. It's again, part of the challenge is creating those scopes, creating those boundaries so that you can properly architect this out. It's very easy in a microservice situation to actually break your model. Like if you're finding yourself if you're changing one container and then you're finding yourself having to test others, you've broken your approach, and it's very easy to do.
I see that.
So it's like it's maintaining that. From my experience, from what I've seen, maintaining that depending on the scope of the application may not make sense. It really depends. Again, it's a very good technology, but it's not necessarily right for every solution or every situation, at least from what I've seen.
No, I think on a next episode we need to dive into when you start talking about even security implications. But before we even jump into that, because that's a whole other topic with gateways, distributing, tracing, and just various things. I want to get into another challenge I see. Because fintechs, if you have a new concept, you really have the advantage to say, okay, how do we want to architect this? It's a greenfield project. What are some options? Now, if you're in a larger investment bank, you have this legacy application, then it switches. So like, okay, we're going to refactor and go through a whole and basically we still need this thing, but now refactor and reposition it. And that's a separate conversation. Mm-hmm. And that presents its own set of challenges. What are your thoughts around that in terms of taking a monolithic application, existing one that's been around for years, and now trying to refactor it into a microservices approach, because you see the advantages, like, definitely starting from scratch is and that, I think that's one of the biggest challenges when you talk about fintech and the incumbent financial services, and trying to refactor those existing apps. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a challenge. I mean, we've many of us, I know you and I both have been in a situation where we've come in and had to work on an application that has, that's been in existence for a long time. The approach to it, and it's difficult, it's, if you look at kind of like software design and how we tend to design applications, a lot of times the application design mirrors the communication model in the company, so it's like, if ops communicates with the wire team in a certain way, or if the DevOps team communicates with the corporate infrastructure in a certain way, we tend to build our applications that way, which is, interesting, right? Because then we kind of build these dependencies on how human beings work. So that is typically how those big applications were built, and like they were built in such a way, and you have to unravel those. So really kind of trying to migrate an old monolithic application to a microservices approach. I think that is a heroic task. That would really be, if you've gone to a fancy restaurant and you get a deconstructed s'more, it's not the same thing as like just putting a marshmallow, a piece of chocolate, and a graham cracker on a plate and just saying you're done. It's not quite that simplistic, right? You actually have to really redesign it. And I think in that situation, either the application needs to be built from the ground up, as a microservice application, or you can migrate potentially to a distributed services application, still monolithic, still better advantages. But I think going from a monolithic, an old legacy monolithic application without going ground up to microservices would be very challenging. It's almost like, it's kind of like if you're thinking of an application, your intention is to go to the cloud. It should be a cloud-based based application from the ground up. You don't want to build internally and then try to migrate to the cloud, because then you're going to have a lot of challenges, right?
That goes into like a whole series, because I know past clients and things I've seen, they say, okay, well, we want to go to the cloud, and some of them operate in a lift and shift model. Basically, we're just going to take what we have on prem and literally lift it and put it in the cloud. Some of them, okay, you know what, we want to not only go to the cloud, but really take advantage of the services that the public cloud offers, right? And the different things, and then that requires refactoring and an approach to really start, as you mentioned before, deconstructing those boundaries. You know what? Before I go on, we have questions for the audience, and we definitely like audience interaction, so we're going to post it. Xavier Williams says, how can an insurance and financial services firm take advantage of this type of technology? I have some ideas to answer that question. Then I'll let you jump in, Dave. I mean, I would say it's, once again, right, and this is something I always say, it's not like building technology for technology's sake. It all depends on what type of business initiative that insurance and financial services firm has, and then, okay, when we're this, and then what type of application will support that business initiative. Then it's like, okay, how are we going to build this application? And we start architecting the various methods, is what we've been talking about, whether it's looking at it from a microservices architecture approach, whether it's looking at it as a hybrid, as Dave mentioned, depending how big, depending on the scalability and so forth. Dave, you could please add into that explanation.
Yeah, no, I think it really depends on the scope of the application, what the goals, what you're trying to do. If say an insurance or a financial services company wants to build an outwardly facing public application that they want customers to come to, that would be a really good place. Especially it's ground up, a really interesting place to start considering the microservices technology, because then you can start looking at those technologies from like AWS or from Docker and things like that can really quickly get you out there. Again, but that's the scope of the application. If we're talking about something internal, or if we're talking about also just how the architecture of the company is set up, if your development team is very small, you have a couple of people doing development, getting that overhead in terms of each small piece of the application, taking over one job isn't maybe not necessary, depending on the scope. So at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is the application architecture, and you have to think about not only utilizing the technology, what's the right architecture of this application, but is my team set up to manage this? In a lot of the examples, if you were to Google online and take a look at some of the examples for where microservices is being used, it's quite frequently in very large applications where there are individual teams working on each piece. That's a very common way of how it's being structured. So you have to kind of think about like how is my team structured, because all those things should align if you're taking on that kind of architecture.
Xavier, Dave, thanks for that response. Xavier, thanks for posting that question, and thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate that. No, I mean it's a definitely very interesting topic. I mean it's definitely one, especially when you start talking about digital transformation, and in financial services firms, on more of the bigger ones, to say, okay, how are we going to do that? I think revisiting the architecture of some of these applications, and also in looking at some of the new business initiatives to say, okay, well, this is what we were doing before. Here's the structure. Let's talk about architecture. Let's talk about our different options, and pulling that in. So I like your point, because I never really thought about it like that, in terms of you have a small team. So, sometimes you have a small team, but then you're trying to replicate the Amazons or Netflix of the world, because their practices are amazing and they're able to release at scale. But are you actually set up for that? right?
Right. Is that practical? Because when you are dividing your application up into microservices, there is still an overhead in terms of the structure and the architecture, and maintaining that. Not necessarily maintaining in the sense of like maintaining the service and things like that, but maintaining that architecture, making sure you don't cross those boundaries, so you don't end up in a monolithic approach, can be challenging too. So again, it's one of those things where you really have to think about what your design is, and microservices should always be one of those design considerations when you're starting a new kind of greenfield application. But it's not necessarily the go-to technology, depending on the team and the scope. Especially if thinking about smaller teams, smaller scoped applications, probably where you may only have like a couple of business boundaries to begin with, might not make sense. But again, looking at your architecture, looking at the scope, is my microservice that I'm going to build something that maybe I can use in the future somewhere else? That's also a consideration to make too. But again, at the end of the day, it's a software architectural decision, and it should never be taken lightly. And it's not one of those things where I've definitely been in the past, and I'm sure you've been too, where we've looked at a technology and said, oh my God, we just have to use this. I don't know what it does. I don't know everything.
100%.
We're just going to use it. Right?
Guilty of that at times of my career. I mean, look, it's the shiny new object, right? It's cool. Right. And, selfishly, sometimes you also want to play around with it too to get some experience in it. But, I'm at a point now, and I've come to this realization over the last few, it's all about the business, man. It's like, what's the bet? And with that mind shift, it really started really thinking about it. Like, hey, I want to achieve a business goal, whether for myself or for my client. What is the best way to get there? Especially now, man, like you look at it from the 90s to now, we just have so much technology. And then, you can't necessarily be an expert in each one of them. So what you have to do is start analyzing the business problem, start looking at, okay, what are the things out there to solve this? And then, start talking to others and doing your research and then picking a path. But starting from the technology aspect and going the other way, that has proven to be not a good path.
We've all been there, right? We've definitely been there.
Yeah, it's definitely proven. Listen, Dave, great stuff. Really happy we started to touch on this, and really get a good overview. I think this is definitely helpful to our audience. And I know it's something that comes up, especially when the big news is on digital transformation. I mean, it's just something to throw in. When we start talking about microservices, as David mentioned, in terms of the overhead, you have to think about authentication now, because that opens a whole new attack vector for APIs. How are when the clients are interacting with these services, thinking about tokens, thinking about how are you actually scanning these containers? It's just various things in terms of app set conversation we need to have that it opens you up now to new problems that you may not have faced before. And I say, and then with each, like with the monolithic aspect, you start looking at, okay, a defense in depth security strategy, right? That's one. You usually kind of have, okay, here are the things that I'm going to do from a security standpoint. Now with you're looking at microservices, you're dealing with many different microservices, different languages. That's various different. That's more. It's widening the security scope. So now you kind of have to think through. All right, let me pull all of these Python apps together with this functionality. This is definitely a path of security you have to put down for defense in depth, depending on the business function. I need to kind of think that. I mean, but just a general approach, I think it should start from your crown jewels, your digital assets. Like, what is it most that you're trying to protect that this particular, you have various different business things that you're trying to solve. Understand the crown jewels for each of those microservices, and then start building a security in depth methodology for each of them, right? And some of them may share certain resources, and some of them may be different. So I think that's a major overhead that some don't take into account when you start looking at monolithic versus microservices.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the security, because you're absolutely right. When you break your application to services, you're going to open up more ports, potentially open up more points of communication. The technologies that are out there, it's like Docker and the AWS microservice containers. They can help you with these areas. There's definitely some technologically some advantages there to using something like that. Again, microservices is an application architecture, not necessarily a technology. Like some people will think, oh, it's Docker, it must be that is a microservice, but you can have microservices, a microservice application without those tools. And yeah, you absolutely have to worry about that kind of security, and how are you going to tie that up and make sure that you're not exposing yourself.
Xavier said, thank you for answering this question. You're very welcome. Thank you for posting it. Really appreciate it.
Cool.
Dave, man, I think this was a very good conversation on microservices and giving a brief overview, something that I wanted to touch on actually for a while. Because, we try to cover various technology aspects within fintech, and this is definitely one of them. So I definitely thank you for coming on board, for lending us your expertise, and for giving me the opportunity to go back and forth with you about that.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Dave,
it's good. It's fun.
As I always ask our guests, how can the audience and people get in touch with you if they wanted to follow up, wanted to learn more about DraftPoint, wanted to learn more about your services and so forth?
I mean, I guess you've got my LinkedIn link. You can always reach out to me directly through LinkedIn, or you can connect me with me there. You can visit our company website as well and get some information about our company. It's www. I don't know if you can put it in the comments, but it's DraftPointInc.com.
Of course we can put it in the comments. Let's do that. We're here to. You said I'm going to put it in the comments right now.
www.DraftPointInc.com. But I think the easiest way to get if you want to reach out to me directly, LinkedIn is probably the best way to do it.
I'm going to put Dave's company right now. I'm here to support my wonderful guests and friends.
I can put it in the comments too, right?
You absolutely can, my friend. But since I started typing it, let's not. I'm going to put www.draftpointinc.com.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
And when I put it in the comments, it went everywhere. It went on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, everywhere. So
Twitch.
Yeah,
oh my gosh, we're on Twitch.
I'm on Twitch, man. Like with the video gamers.
I know. I'm saying let's drop off and start playing some games.
I know, right? I want to get. You know what? Last question, man. Outside of this, what's up with gas, man? How you doing? You good?
Yeah, we're pretty good. I mean, we filled up, we filled the tank up, so we're.
Oh, you were a panic buyer?
So we're fine. We went out, bought a whole bunch of gas. No, I think with the pipeline issue being restored, I think I think we should be at least in our area we should be okay. But I think it definitely brings to light the exposure that we have. In terms of security. And I know that's an area that you're really interested in, which is, kind of like how we can manage that type of security, those type of security risks. And that's scary, honestly, from a, I don't traditionally, do a lot with security at that level, but for, certainly a person who uses a car, wants to buy gas when I need it, knowing that we have those risks is, that's it's a little scary. It's a little frightening.
Yeah, so those are all good points. I mean, what I'm going to do is it actually was a ransomware attack,
right?
And I did a ransomware video last year, 10 months ago. Basically saying, this is a big deal. Here are different ways that you could get compromised. And what I will do is my goal will be to put that ransomware video, and the chat was a LinkedIn video, just basically telling you what ransomware is, telling you different ways you can protect your organization from it. So I'll add it to the chat. And I said in 2000, I literally said, I think that was 10 months ago, and I said in 2021, it's expected to cost X amount of dollars to the industry. And yeah, that's happening. So
yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah,
I wish I was.
It's fantastic you're posting it. Not that it happened.
Yeah, I wish I could predict stocks like that. We hold different conversations.
I know, or cryptocurrency.
I know, right? So, listen, man. Good stuff. Once again, thank you very much for jumping on board, and you enjoy your weekend.
Great, thank you. You too. Have a good weekend, everybody listening. Have a great weekend.
All right, cheers, guys.
Bye, everybody.